Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
Thanksgiving was supposed to be about healing, about putting the pieces back together. But that night, it became a nightmarish memory I'll never forget. I never wanted to go in the first place, not after everything that had happened. But when Simon called, his voice uncharacteristically soft, I felt a sliver of hope. He wanted us all to come over, to fix things. "We're family," he had said. "Let's put the past behind us." It sounded sincere enough to convince me, and apparently Vincent too. We agreed. It had been 6 months since we'd all been in the same room. 6 months of silence, resentment, and unspoken accusations. When I arrived at Simon's house, the air already felt wrong, too heavy, too still. His house stood in the middle of nowhere, isolated, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to bend inward, as if trying to swallow it whole. The front door creaked ominously as I stepped inside, and the faint smell of overcooked turkey lingered in the air. Simon greeted me with a strained smile. His eyes were hollow, dark crescents hanging beneath them like shadows that wouldn't let go. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Vincent and his wife Carol arrived shortly after. Carol, glowing with the warmth of her pregnancy, tried to brighten the room with cheerful small talk. But Simon's energy dampened everything. He shuffled around the kitchen, muttering to himself as he set the table with a mismatched collection of plates and silverware. The meal he'd prepared was as chaotic as the man himself. Dry turkey, lumpy mashed potatoes, and green beans that looked like they'd been boiled into oblivion. But it wasn't the food that made my stomach churn. It was the tension, thick and oppressive, suffocating the room. We sat in uneasy silence until Carol broke it, her voice light and casual. "So, Simon, how's everything going? Business okay?" Simon froze, his fork hovering mid-air. The room went so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking in the hall. Slowly he lowered the fork and looked at Carol, his expression unreadable. Then his lips twisted into a sneer. "Shut up, Carol," he said, his voice low and venomous. "It's not about money." Vincent stiffened beside her. "Don't talk to my wife like that." Simon's sneer deepened. "You wouldn't need to ask if you weren't so greedy. I hope your greed kills you." A chill swept through me. His words didn't feel like an insult. They felt like a curse. Vincent leaned forward, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" he demanded. Simon didn't answer. Instead, he gestured at the table, at the food piled high on our plates. "Keep eating," he said, his tone icy. "Keep stuffing your faces. I hope it kills you." My stomach twisted, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Vincent slammed his fork down, his voice rising. "Simon, what did you do?" Simon leaned back in his chair, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't poison the food," he said, but there was something in his voice, a mocking edge that made my skin crawl. We all stared at him, the tension in the room unbearable. Then, out of nowhere, Carol gasped. She clutched her chest, her eyes wide with panic. I can't," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper before she started coughing violently. Her face turned ashen, and she collapsed to the floor, convulsing. "Carol," Vincent shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. As I relayed the situation to the dispatcher, I glanced up to see Vincent towering over Simon, his fists clenched. "What did you do to her?" Vincent roared, grabbing Simon by the collar and shaking him. Simon didn't fight back. He just stared at Vincent with cold, empty eyes. "I didn't poison her," he repeated. "But maybe it's what she deserves, what all of you deserve." Before Vincent could react, Simon wrenched free and bolted for the door. Vincent shouted for me to stay with Carol and ran after him. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, my heart pounding as I watched the paramedics arrive and work to stabilize Carol. Minutes later, I found Vincent outside, pinning Simon to the ground as the police arrived. Simon didn't resist. He didn't say a word as they cuffed him and led him away. But as they pushed him into the back of the squad car, he looked at me, his lips curling into a chilling smile. "Your greed will kill you all," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Those words have haunted me ever since. Carol survived, but she was never the same after that night. And our family, it's broken beyond repair. Simon's actions tore apart whatever fragile ties had held us together. I still don't know what he meant that night. If he'd truly done something to the food, or if his words were just the ramblings of a bitter, broken man. But I can't shake the feeling that his curse was real. Sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice in my head, repeating those chilling words, "Your greed will kill you all." And I wonder, was he right? It began with an unsettling chill, the kind that creeps up your spine when you sense someone's watching you. But there was no one there, at least not yet. Every Thanksgiving, I volunteered at the local homeless shelter. It wasn't just a tradition. It was a way to remind myself how fortunate I was. This year, however, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker, and there was an unshakable feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. Cynthia, my best friend, had reluctantly agreed to join me. She'd never set foot in a place like this before. 20 years old and dripping in privilege, Cynthia lived a life of luxury designer clothes, Michelin-starred dinners, and a sheltered worldview. Convincing her to step out of her bubble had been an uphill battle, but I hoped the experience would open her eyes. Maybe she'd see the world differently, gain some perspective, and realize how much she took for granted. When we arrived at the shelter, it was already bustling with activity. Volunteers hurried to prepare meals while regulars shuffled in, grateful for a warm place to sit and eat. Cynthia stood out like a diamond in the dirt. Her bright red designer coat, pristine boots, and glittering diamond bracelet caught every eye in the room. The contrast was jarring. She was a beacon of wealth in a sea of struggle. I noticed the stares almost immediately, but she seemed oblivious, smiling politely and awkwardly holding a tray of food. And then I saw him. He was sitting alone at a corner table, his head lowered as he shoveled food into his mouth. His clothes were tattered, his hair a matted mess, and his eyes were wild. They darted around the room before landing on Cynthia. His gaze lingered, burning with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Something about him felt wrong, dangerous. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just curious about the new face in the shelter. But as the minutes passed, his staring became more blatant, more aggressive. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched, and his breathing grew heavier. It was like watching a storm gather strength, the air crackling with unseen electricity. But it wasn't fine. The man stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound sliced through the chatter, silencing the room. All eyes turned toward him as he began marching toward Cynthia. My heart dropped into my stomach. "Hey, you!" he shouted, his voice sharp and angry. Cynthia turned, her face a mix of confusion and unease. "Me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yeah, you," he growled, pointing a calloused finger at her. "What do you think you're doing here?" I'm just volunteering," she stammered, her usual poise cracking under his intense glare. "Volunteering?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "No, you're just showing off. Look at you. That coat, those boots, that bracelet. You think you're better than us, don't you?" "No, that's not—" Cynthia began, but he cut her off. "You rich people are all the same," he spat. "You come in here flaunting your wealth, pretending to care, but you don't. You don't know what it's like to be us, to have nothing." I stepped in, placing myself between him and Cynthia. "Hey, calm down, she's just here to help." She didn't mean any harm. His eyes snapped to mine, filled with rage. "Help?" he repeated, his voice rising. "She's not helping anyone. She's just here to make herself feel better." Before I could respond, he grabbed his plate and hurled it at Cynthia. The food hit her chest, splattering across her coat and dripping onto the floor. Gasps echoed through the room as everyone froze, too shocked to move. "You deserved that," he said coldly. "That's what you get for thinking you're better than us." "We need to go," I whispered, grabbing Cynthia's arm. She was too stunned to resist as I pulled her toward the door. The man's voice followed us, a torrent of anger and bitterness that made my skin crawl. The cold night air hit us like a slap as we stepped outside. Cynthia's hands were trembling, her face pale. I didn't mean," she began, but her voice broke. "I know," I said, trying to calm her. "Let's just get to the car." But before we could take another step, I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind us. Slow at first, then faster. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw him. The man was running toward us, his wild eyes locked on Cynthia. "Run!" I shouted, shoving her forward. But it was too late. He reached her in seconds, grabbing her by the throat and yanking her backward. Cynthia screamed, her hands clawing at his as he squeezed tighter and tighter. I lunged at him, trying to pull him off her, but he was stronger than he looked. He swung his arm, knocking me to the ground. My head hit the concrete, and pain exploded through my skull. The world tilted and blurred, but I forced myself to focus. Cynthia was gasping for air, her face turning a sickly shade of purple as she struggled against his grip. And then I saw it. A glint of metal in his hand. A knife. Panic surged through me as I tried to crawl toward them, but my body refused to cooperate. I screamed for help, my voice hoarse and desperate. For a moment I thought it was over. I thought I was about to lose her. But then, out of nowhere, a group of men appeared. Regulars from the shelter. They rushed toward us, shouting and waving their arms. One of them tackled the man, knocking him to the ground. The knife clattered to the pavement as the others piled on, pinning him down. The police arrived minutes later, arresting the man and hauling him away. Cynthia and I were taken to the hospital. She had bruises on her neck, and I was diagnosed with a concussion. But we were alive. That was all that mattered. Cynthia couldn't stop apologizing, but it wasn't her fault. The man's anger wasn't about her. It was about his pain, his hopelessness. It was a harsh reminder of how fragile the line between despair and violence can be. That night changed us both. For Cynthia, it was a brutal wake-up call. For me, it was a reminder of the darkness people carry inside them, a darkness that can explode without warning. I'll never forget the look in that man's eyes, or the feeling of helplessness as I watched him hurt someone I cared about. Some wounds never heal, but they teach us. And this Thanksgiving, I learned more than I ever wanted to about the monsters we create when we let the world break us. The air felt different that morning, dense, heavy, and unsettling. As we approached the cabin, a chill seeped into my bones, though the late autumn sun still shone through the bare trees. Something about this trip felt wrong from the beginning, but none of us dared to admit it. It was supposed to be a chance to reconnect, to patch up old wounds, to find normalcy in the wake of a messy breakup that had fractured our once inseparable group. But deep down, I knew we weren't going to leave that cabin the same. There were 5 of us once: Tom, Amber, Sandy, Mike, and me. College friends who swore we'd stick together forever. Tom and Amber were the golden couple, the ones who radiated joy and light wherever they went. Sandy and Mike, the high school sweethearts who always seemed to be chasing that same perfection, but never quite catching it. And then there was me, the quiet one, the observer, always there, but never fully part of the picture. This year, though, the cracks in our foundation had finally spread too far. Sandy and Mike had ended things after years of trying to hold on. Their breakup wasn't dramatic, but it lingered like an open wound. Mike refused to come on the trip. He said he needed space. I hadn't planned to go either, but Sandy needed support, and I couldn't leave her alone with Tom and Amber's relentless happiness. So I took Mike's place. We arrived at the cabin on a crisp November afternoon. It was nestled deep in the woods, miles from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just us and the wilderness. The cabin was picturesque wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a wide porch overlooking a lake that shimmered in the fading light. For a moment I almost believed we could salvage this trip. But the shadows stretched long that evening, and the silence between us was deafening. Thanksgiving morning started quietly. Amber and Tom busied themselves in the kitchen, preparing the traditional feast as if nothing had changed. Sandy sat by the window, staring out at the woods with a look I couldn't quite place. Grief? Anger? Something darker? I tried to engage her in conversation, but she only offered clipped responses, her tone sharp and distant. "I'm fine," she'd said for the third time that morning, though her eyes betrayed her. The meal was ready by late afternoon. We gathered around the table, the golden light from the setting sun casting eerie shadows on the walls. The food smelled incredible: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, but the atmosphere was tense. Amber tried to keep things light, joking about past trips and shared memories. Tom chimed in, laughing easily as always, but Sandy was a storm cloud, silent and brooding. Then Amber made the mistake. "It's such a shame Mike couldn't be here," she said, her voice dripping with forced cheer. "It doesn't feel the same without him, you know." Sandy's fork clattered onto her plate. Her eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto Amber. The room seemed to freeze, the air thickening with unspoken tension. "Maybe," Sandy said, her voice low and trembling, "Mike would still be here if it weren't for you two." The words hung in the air like a curse. Tom leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone defensive. Sandy's voice rose, trembling with rage. "You two and your perfect little fairy tale, always showing off, always rubbing it in our faces. Mike couldn't take it anymore. He said he couldn't keep competing with you." Amber's face paled. "Sandy, that's not fair." "Not fair?" Sandy shot to her feet, her hands slamming onto the table. "You think this is fair? Watching everything fall apart while you two play house? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Tom's laughter cut through the tension like a blade. "You're crazy," he said, shaking his head. "Mike left because he didn't want you anymore. Don't blame us for your problems." And that's when it snapped. Sandy reached for the carving knife. It gleamed in the dim light as she lunged across the table, her scream raw and primal. The blade plunged into Tom's chest once, twice, 3 times before any of us could react. Blood sprayed across the table, pooling on the floor. Amber shrieked, scrambling to pull Sandy away, but Sandy was unstoppable, her movements fueled by a fury I'd never seen before. I was frozen, my mind unable to process the horror unfolding before me. Tom gasped for air, his hands clawing at the knife embedded in his chest. Amber wrestled Sandy to the ground, her sobs echoing through the cabin. Finally, she managed to pry the knife from Sandy's grip, but the damage was done. Tom lay motionless, his eyes wide and glassy. "Call someone," Amber screamed at me, her voice breaking. "Call for help." My hands fumbled for my phone, but there was no service. Panic clawed at my throat as I bolted out the door, running blindly into the woods. The trees blurred past me, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding like a drum. Finally, I stumbled upon a small house, its windows glowing with warm light. I banged on the door, desperate, pleading for help. An elderly couple answered, their faces etched with concern. They called the police, their voices calm and steady in contrast to my hysteria. By the time the authorities arrived, it was too late. Tom was dead. Sandy was dead too. Amber had fought back, defending herself in a final, desperate act of survival. The cabin was a scene from a nightmare, blood staining every surface, the scent of Thanksgiving dinner mingling with the metallic tang of death. Amber survived, but she was forever changed. Her once bright eyes were haunted, her laughter silenced. When Mike heard what had happened, he blamed himself, convinced that his absence had set everything in motion. But it wasn't his fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. Or maybe it was all of ours. We tried to move on, but the weight of that night never lifted. The cabin still stands, a silent witness to the horrors that unfolded within its walls. Sometimes I dream of that place, of Sandy's screams, of Tom's lifeless eyes. I wake up gasping, my heart racing, the memories as vivid as the day they happened. We thought we'd grow old together, still taking trips, still laughing around a table. But life had other plans, and now, Thanksgiving is a day of mourning, a reminder of how everything can change in an instant, how love and friendship can twist into something unrecognizable, how even the most idyllic setting can become a nightmare, and how none of us are ever truly safe, not from each other and not from ourselves.